then set this up for recording. But then we'll just begin with the chanting the once again, chanting the praise to Manjushri. With the brilliance of your wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness enclosing my mind, enlighten my intelligence and wisdom, so that I may gain insight into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them. So presently we are in the 9th chapter of Treasury of Precious Qualities. And this is the chapter that instructs us on how to engage the Bodhisattva vow. So throughout the work of Treasury of Precious Qualities, which is very much aimed towards practitioners, it does have a fair bit of instruction in terms of understanding the view, but the mere material, which begins with appreciating our present situation, the precious human rebirth, already assumes that we have a good grasp of what the Buddhist path is all about and the premises for the Buddhist path, what we mean with how the mind constructs samsara and nirvana, what is meant with enlightenment, what is the situation when we are caught in samsara, the need for refuge, the scope of the path. And in this way, it's very much something that would be very helpful along with the practice of the Vajrayana preliminaries. Now, in the present chapter then, on the application of the Bodhisattva vow, we've looked a fair bit at what it involves in terms of what we should avoid, what we should do, and so on. And now we're particularly looking at the bodhicitta of application. So when we talk about the engaging in the Bodhisattva vow, we understand this in terms of what is our wish? What do we want to do? What is it that really lies at the heart of our being now that we've become bodhisattvas? We've taken this step into bodhisattvahood. We've made the commitment to that. And so the first thing is really to generate the attitude of aspiration, that what really is our life is about is serving sentient beings, both in terms of, you could say, temporary benefit and also ultimate benefit. And then it goes into the bodhicitta of application. That's where we actually have the practices of the paramitas, actions or ways that take us beyond ego, the cause of suffering, ignorance. So these are, if you like, you could say are enlightened actions. Sometimes we say transcendent actions. Paramita means to take us beyond. And so we've looked at the paramita of generosity. And now we're looking at the second paramita, the paramita of discipline, shila. And we've had a look. The thing about the paramita of discipline in a Buddhist context is that it's really rich. It's really complex. It's really rich, and it's, you could say, a tremendous opportunity to really appreciate the greatness of the path and the greatness of those that not only are upholding the path, but also have brought the path to fruition and what it actually involves. Now, the thing is, we're here not as voyeurs and sort of onlookers, but this is very much about our path. And so maybe we are lay people, maybe we're not monastics, but still to appreciate what the monastic path involves actually elicits a lot of respect for the monastic path. And similarly also then for the vows of the Bodhisattva and the vows of the Vijayadaras. So these are the three levels of vows that we would generally understand as constituting the paramita of discipline. But in fact, what we mean with discipline at any given moment is simply just to refrain from what is not helpful and embrace what is helpful. Simple as that. But that's where there's a very, you could say, incisive and deep and profound insight and on how to actually apply this. It's not just like we very often in a modern culture sort of poo-poo the idea of discipline as some sort of repression of our natural instincts or whatever. And that's simply just because the practice of discipline is understood in a very as something very unskillful. But that's not the case in the Buddhist path of enlightenment. It's quintessentially, you could say ultimately skillful. And that's why every little aspect of knowledge around discipline is really hugely relevant for our journey. So, so anyway, so the text, the present shloka, the present stanza that we're looking at, actually has a lot of commentary. Kangyur Rinpoche has a lot to say about this. And the stanza itself speaks about, it's number 61, says, but the respective aspects of the vows are not alloyed or mixed. As antidote and in their purpose, they are all the same. The vows are gradually transmuted and their qualities enhanced. Thus they remain without essential contradiction. Their observance should be fitted to the situation. Now again, remember that the vows that we, as we understand it in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, and it actually also applies in other Buddhist traditions as well, is really that you have the foundation of what we call the path of individual liberation, pratimoksha, the monastic discipline, but it's a bit more than monastics only. It really also covers the lay people, but very much from the point of view of the individual liberation, the discipline that essentially puts an end to the cause of suffering. The second level are then the trainings of the bodhisattva, which are then much more than just the individual cause, and very much about a greater vision of reality that also includes a complete dedication to the selfless, aspiration to, and the application also to establish all beings in enlightenment. So simply serving all sentient beings, but also with a much greater understanding of the nature of reality. And then the Vajrayana is the quintessential path of wisdom, the path of non-delusion, the path of integrating insight. And this extends to the complete, you could say, re-evaluation and a complete radical, you could say, a radical approach to understanding our reality and also to understanding the path, where we engage the quintessential aspect of our awakened nature, Buddha nature. We engage that as the path itself from the very outset. So that's an incredibly profound path. But all of these all reflect the single objective of extracting ourselves from confusion, from samsara. And so there's no kind of real difference. There's no conflict. It's not as if the bodhisattvas look down on the monastics, or the Vajrayana people look down on the bodhisattvas and the monastics. It's a bit like a process of growth. And once you attain a new level of growth, you build that on the previous place where you were. And as such, these all fit beautifully together. But then again, because their application is so different, it's very important to actually really have a clear understanding on how they actually do effectively integrate. So that's where Kangyur Rinpoche has a fair bit to say about that. So we'll look at the commentary here. And what we looked at last time is the way in which a practitioner, the practitioners at different levels, they integrate difficult circumstances. And so that's where the classical way of defining the differences in the vows is to say at the level of the individual liberation, when a monk or a nun, a monastic, comes across something that is normally seen as the cause of suffering, such as toxic states of mind, aggression, or desire, then that is rejected. There's simply just on the basis of antidotes, conceptual antidotes, and the practice of discipline and so on, that is avoided. The bodhisattvas, however, they understand the empty nature of this, and so they're not really worried about the existence of the arisings in the mind. But the Vajrayanists, they have this capacity for remaining unconfused. And that's where any movement that happens in the mind is seen as the ornament of wisdom. And this, of course, you could say is a very high scope, but nevertheless, it is seen as something that is possible. And it is then the scope of Vajrayana Yoga to then integrate what we then refer to as the poisons. So that we've looked at last time. It's here where it says, in the sort of talking about the Vajrayana yogi who can, you could say, integrate the arisings of kleshas. It says here, it is like the peacock that feeds indiscriminately on poisonous flowers, thereby becoming ever more youthful and beautiful in its plumage. So that's where there is then you could say, a certain ascension of capacity. But again, that's where this has to be understood with a lot of subtlety. So here then, the commentary continues, a monk who chastely refrains from sexual intercourse, though he has the capacity for it, remains unstained by lust. So that's where somebody who is, of course, it wouldn't really apply if it's somebody who doesn't have any desire to begin with, but somebody who does have desire and yet keeps with the practice of celibacy, they are then, even though lust arises, then they're not, you could say, ruled by it. So that's why we would say they're unstained by lust. The yogi practicing on the path of the third initiation, now that refers to, again, this is where we're not talking monastics then we're talking those who practice yoga and who have all the necessary prerequisites, which are the completion of what we call the first empowerment, the second empowerment, and then at the level of the third empowerment, such a person then is someone who is capable of engaging in sexual intercourse with another person where this only serves the purpose of awakening. There's no ego, there's no ordinary lust. And that's where it then says, the yogi practicing on the path of the third initiation indulges in sexual intercourse, and he or she too is unstained by lust. Now, these two approaches look vastly different. But the point is that they're actually both individuals who abide by a discipline. It says here, both monk and yogi fulfill the vital point of antidote, which is destroying the ordinary clinging to self. And so it says this fulfills the vital point of antidote and purpose, and thereby perfectly observe their vows concerning defilement. The thing about the yogic approach is it's much more difficult. It requires a tremendous training, just in terms of the physical aspect of it, and also in terms of the wisdom that doesn't just use this path as some sort of way to, some sort of sneaky way to to accommodate their own particular desire. And that's where there's a lot of funny stories around this, as you can imagine. But at the same time, those stories about, you could say, the comedy of that is that there are also authentic individuals who definitely have the capacity to integrate this. And that applies both in terms of the monks and also in terms of the yogis. There are persons who really genuinely benefit from this. And that's, of course, the intention. These are incredibly skillful ways to eliminate the causes of suffering and to enhance the qualities of the accomplishment of the path. So that's where it says here, the ground in which a poisonous plant grows has no intention either to help or harm. And that's why we could say as such, the libido that is the basis for the sexual drive, that's simply just what we could call nature. Okay, it's perhaps has particular karmic conditioning and so on, but it's just there. And as such, it doesn't really go one way or another by its very nature. And that's also where, for example, in the Buddhist teaching, we wouldn't say libido is something sinful. It's simply just, it's there. It's part of the landscape. So by analogy, so then giving some idea of how this applies, yogis and yoginis remaining in the view of the natural great perfection are untouched by defilement. That means a yogi or a yogini who remains in a condition of not being deluded at any time, not falling into dualistic craving or grasping, they are untouched by defilement. They're not in any way, you could say, tainted or conditioned by this. So that's where, for them, then intercourse does not in any way constitute something which is, let's say, an obstacle. They do not reject it. They do not transmute it. Neither do they take it as the path. They are totally free from such exertion. So that's where you have those that practice particular path where they transmute desire. But then again, there might be those who are entirely beyond even transmutation. And that's then at the level of the fourth empowerment, the practice of the great perfection. So that's where it says, as it is said in the Kunche Gyalpo, the all-creating King Tantra, it says, all appearances are one in suchness. Therefore, let no alteration be imposed. This kingly state of uncontrived equality is thought-free, dharmakaya, simple presence. So that's where we have then various ways in which a single action is then engaged in various ways according to the level of the vow and the commitment and the discipline. Then we have something called the transmutation of the vow. That's where then it says, Gyalwa Longchenpa, in his commentary on his absorption's easeful rest. Okay, that's then what is nowadays, by the same translators actually, translated as finding rest in meditation, I think it is. And then it says, there he gives, Longchenpa gives a quote from the Tantra Sangwa Chöpen, the secret adornment, secret tiara, something like that. It says here, for thus we may observe that copper is derived from stone, from copper, gold. When copper has been smelted out, the stone is gone. Transmuted into gold, the copper is no more. The Buddhas have not taught that pratimoksha and the bodhisattva vow remain within the minds of inner monks, the Vichadaras. Now, this is how the vows, then you could say, they serve to gradually increase the refinement of one's spiritual path. And of course, here the analogy comes from Indian alchemy. And I'm not sure that alchemy never really took off. It's a concept, it's very beautiful, but the practicalities of it, I'll leave it to those who have a good grasp of physics, but I'm not sure actually that gold could arise from copper. But anyway, there used to be some notion of lead doing the job. But that's really secondary. And the meaning is going to be pretty obvious here, where he then says, commenting on the meaning of this, Gyalwa Longchenpa says that the pratimoksha vow and the bodhicitta vow do not persist in the mind as separate entities when the state of tantric vijadhara is attained. And that's kind of like we say when you're 10 years old, and then you grow up and you're 15. Well, you're still not, you're of course, your 15-year being 15 means that you're no longer 10. But then again, it's thanks to having been 10 that you are 15, etc. Right? So that's where the likewise also you could say as you graduate on the path, then the vows are not, they're not really, they're not there in the same way. We'll look at this. So it says here, the vows are rather transmuted into the substance of the mantrayana vow. So Longchenpa says, on the level of the secret mantra, the two lower vows are transmuted into a single entity. Nevertheless, the specific aspects of the three vows do not merge and mingle into one. From the moment the vows are taken and until they deteriorate, these aspects remain separate and distinct. So again, when we, let's say, a rice, what's called a rice seed becomes a rice sprout and then a rice plant, well, you could say that is a transmutation that takes place. But it's not as if that at one point you both have the seed and the sprout. They're simply just, once the sprout is there, the seed is, you could say, abandoned. And in this way, the vows simply, you could say, transform. But they all come with their own particular qualities. And of course, they all are hugely respected. So that's where, again, when as we've reached the age we have, we can't reject the fact that we've had another age. And likewise, also the rice sprout doesn't reject that it had another stage, namely being a seed. So that's where there's simply, you could say, an organic process of growth that takes place. But there's also the notion, this is what we will see, which really defines one of the defining qualities of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, is that you can actually have all three at once, but it's more that the higher ones are more important. So that's where you have, for example, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He's a monk, but he's also a bodhisattva. He's also a tantrika. So you have here Kangyur Rinpoche says, with regards to the notion of the transformation of the vows, some authorities interpret the expression inner monks, the Vijayadharas, as a statement occurring later in the present text, that transformation is produced by wisdom, as implying that unless the extraordinary example or ultimate wisdom manifests, no transformation of the vow can be said to take place. So that's where, for us to talk about this, you could say the inner monks, that is really those that have achieved a greater capacity of that, which is the objective of being a monk, namely the process of enlightenment, which we've established. All the various vows, they all have the exact same objective. And so that's where then the one vow serves as the foundation for a greater development. So it says here, the teacher of our lineage has said that there was good reason for this assertion. Others, however, think that transformation occurs merely on the reception of the empowerment. So that's where we would understand that there can be a gradual process. But of course, what very often happens practically is that someone who is a monastic or who abides by the pratimoksha, the foundational vows, then receives the bodhisattva vow. And that's just receiving the bodhisattva vow or receiving empowerment. That's very good. The foundation is laid, but it doesn't necessarily mean that one is at that point then a bodhisattva. One should think of oneself as a bodhisattva, yes, but one actually is still, you could say, where one is in terms of one's actual authentic development, even though one might, you might be appointed a new higher job within some hierarchy of corporate context or some institution, but you're still, you might be appointed that, but you're still, in the learning process as you begin to, take hold of your particular new job or office. So that's where the formality is almost secondary. And Kangyur Rinpoche says, my own view is that it is possible to speak of transformation happening even when the extraordinary wisdom, which is uncompounded in all its aspects, has not yet occurred. So that's where we can't say that there's some sort of linear, you could say, a clear-cut understanding of when and how this transformation takes place. So here it says, this wisdom may be either example wisdom or ultimate wisdom. These are identical in their nature and form. They are simply in that example, they are different in that example wisdom is accompanied by conceptual movement. And that's where we talk about some, on the path, we talk about a degree of insight, which gives us some idea of what authentic wisdom is like. And then there's the authentic wisdom itself. But when you have the example wisdom, then we are still talking about something that is, you could say, mapped and objectified and held as something that is really indicative of something. It's not actually the real deal. But all of this really refers to the process that occurs in the, you could say, development along the path. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, he says, however, I do not believe that transformation occurs just through sitting in an assembly and receiving an empowerment, touching one's three centers with the blessed substances and tasting them. And that's where we have rituals such as the Bodhisattva vow. And also here, what Kangyur Rinpoche is referring to is a Vajrayana empowerment. So he says, the essence of the Pratimoksha vow is the determination to free oneself from samsara. The essence of the Bodhisattva vow is the promise to benefit others. The essence of the Mantrayana view is pure perception. So that's where, obviously, that's the essence of these you would say, the discipline. And the ritual itself is secondary. So he says, however, the vows or ordinations will not be true and authentic simply through a vague desire for freedom, a vague wish that others be well, or a vague notion of pure perception. The vows must be held with a clear and definite attitude. It is when this occurs that one can speak of a transformation taking place. So to receive the ritual, the empowerment, and then someone sort of has a vague idea of what this actually involves, having received, a particular empowerment, Avalokiteshvara, Tara, whatever, one has this empowerment, and one sort of has a rough idea that one is this supposed to do something, but it's all very unclear, really. It's not vivid every moment. And it's that point where to sort of speak of oneself as being a holder of the Mantrayana vows is something that lacks the insight into what really it is about. It really is about, like he says here, the essence of the Bodhisattva vow is the promise to benefit others. The essence of the Mantrayana vow is pure perception. So that's where the discipline is really happening. So just having sat in a ceremony where one received the vase on top of one's head and tasted a few drops of something, that might not necessarily be sufficient. So then he says, the definition of the Pratimoksha vow is the discipline of refraining from wrong action, combined with the determination to free oneself from samsara, and this within the environment of the desire realm. So again, that's where what we understand with the Pratimoksha vow is where we take responsibility for ourselves. What we call individual liberation means that we're aware that we need to do something about ourselves, and we do this with then the wish to extract ourselves from confusion altogether. And then it says here, in his Vinaya Mula Sutra, Gunaprabha sets forth, quote, the discipline related to the determination to free oneself from samsara. So that's where we sometimes translate this as renunciation. So that Pratimoksha is associated with renunciation, determination to be free. Some might be monastics, some might be lay people, but it's very much about us taking responsibility for extracting ourselves from this painful condition of samsara. The Abhidharma, Kangyur Rinpoche then writes, the Abhidharma goes on to define the types of people eligible to take the vow in this way. It says, with the exception of persons whose sexual organs are either lacking or atrophied, hermaphrodites, and the inhabitants of the northern continent of Uttarakuru, all beings are capable of positive vows and negative vows. So there are those who, for some reason, you could say are asexual or in some way or another simply not equipped with the desire and the capacity to fulfill desire. Apart from such individuals, then what we're talking about here is the persons who have then a particular desire and the capacity to carry it through. They then can have positive vows or negative vows, and I think simply just the here, what is it? Dom and domin, yeah, domin, yeah. Vow and non-vow. I think we simply just understand that they are able to either be committed to the path or also not committed to the path. And that means simply as they have a choice. In the case of persons who are not sexual, and as we understand it, then it doesn't apply. But when there is the option, then you can opt one way or another. And so that's where there is a notion of actually taking some vows. And this is taken up by Sakyapandita in his vow, the three vows distinguish, which states, beside the human inhabitants of the three cosmic continents, ordination is forbidden to other beings. So this is a sort of a funny way of putting it, but it really just means that this applies to the ordinary beings that we're familiar with. Okay, I'll read through this footnote here. It says, there are 4 additional impediments to taking the pratimoksha vows of Shramanera and full ordination. These are Kyoe Bache, a congenital obstacle, that is, to be born without the capacity for sexual activity, and therefore to be without the basis of the vow. So that's where you could say there's not an issue. Nepe Bache, an environmental obstacle, namely the lack of permission on the part of one's family or secular authorities, thereby running the risk of being compelled to repudiate the vow. So this is about taking the vows where if you're taking the vows, but it then turns out that this is something that, if you're in some countries, if you leave for example, your native religion and you embrace another path, then that's seen as treason or it's unacceptable. Or you might even have your family, which simply won't have it. And all of this entails complications. That really is an obstacle. Then it's kipabache, individual and private obstacles, that is, to be so young as to be incapable of scaring crows away, or to be infirm or seriously handicapped to the point where keeping the vows become an intolerable burden, with the result that it is impossible to develop the qualities that observance of the vows is meant to produce. So that's where we, first of all, might be too young. That's a lovely way of defining a particular age. So if you're so young that you can't scare crows away, that's pretty young. Or else there's simpler, just you could say, physical impediments that get in the way of essentially the vows really functioning the way they're intended. So there's tsebe bache, to be deformed by physical appearance as to color and shape, and to follow an evil profession such as butchery, thereby creating a scandal which weakens the faith of people in the Buddha Dharma. So that's where you might be born into being a butcher, or somehow committed to being a butcher, and in ways that then creates scandal. It should be noted that these last 2 obstacles are not insurmountable. Okay, so there's ways around this. Anyway, So that's really just to talk about the ones that can take the vow. So that's particularly with regards to the vow of individual liberation, pratimoksha. Now, the vow of bodhicitta is defined as the extraordinary practice of the six transcendent perfections, combined with the wish to accomplish unsurpassable enlightenment for the sake of others. So that's where we then are looking at what we're looking at presently, the 6 paramitas. And it's done then with this particular motivation of bodhicitta. The vow is the state of consciousness concomitant with the mental factor of intention, the firm resolve to abstain from all faults of thought, word, and deed that run counter to the 6 transcendent perfections. So that's where this vow is that we wish to avoid anything that would corrupt the six transcendent perfections, which are then generosity, discipline, patience, diligence, samadhi, and prajna. As it is said in the Abhisamaya Lamkara, bodhicitta is the wish to gain perfect, pure enlightenment for others' sake. And in the Bodhicharyavatara, it is said, deciding to refrain from every harmful act is said to be transcendent discipline. So the Mantrayana vow is defined as the state of consciousness concomitant with the mental factor of intending to arrest by means of the primordial wisdom wherein knowledge and method are united, the mental processes which apprehend and cling to phenomena as really existent, together with the negative thoughts, words, and deeds that arrive from this. As it is said in the Garland of Light, showing co-emergent wisdom through the use of signs, restraining all defiling thought. All this defines, as long as space remains, the tantric vow of Vijayadharas. So that's where the Mantrayana vow, in a way, is, you could say, the highest, most advanced kind of vow, because it really just says, it suggests that the vow in this discipline, in this context, is simply to not be deluded, to remain in a place of wisdom in which the ordinary deluded dualistic fixation takes place, to remain in that state, and to from that place to not in any way be, you say, driven to actions with body, speech, and mind that constitute ordinary delusion or ordinary, you could say, condition of samsara. So that's that state of wisdom in itself, that absence of delusion. That's really the vow of the Mantrayana, it was saying. So here, with regards to when it says here, showing co-emergent wisdom through the use of science, it refers to empowerment, and that's where it then says restraining all defiling thought. And that's where then Dinghu Rinpoche, he says, in the course of the empowerment, the teacher uses symbols, implied meanings, and signs to introduce the wisdom that has dwelt within the mind from the very beginning, thus holding in check the inveterate habit of viewing phenomena as ordinary. So that's where the particular Vajrayana approach is to the teacher introducing reality beyond the way that we ordinarily, you could say, taint it or filter it through our confusion. And that's where it's then the introduction to the purity of ourselves, the purity of reality. And so then it says, and it is said in the Tantra Shima that a vow is the promise to observe the Samaya without breaking it, even in dreams. So that speaks about the depth of commitment. The 3 vows must be received according to their own respective rituals. However, right? So there's particular, these three vows, the monastic ordination, for example, or the pratimoksha ordination, is very specific, has its own particular rituals and so on. And as we saw earlier, in fact, quite complex. Then we have the ordination as bodhisattvas. This is a lot less complex, but nevertheless, equally, if not more profound. And then finally, we have the ordination according to the Vajrayana, which is then actually what we then refer to as empowerment or initiation. So that's where these various vows, they have their own particular rituals. However, even if the vows of the lay or monastic state are taken in accordance with the pure rituals of the pratimoksha, if the underlying intention is to practice discipline only as a protection from suffering and as a means to gain temporary benefit, the vows themselves remain of only nominal value. All right? So we might actually take the vow of monastics just to simply have a comfortable life, or it's just convenient. But actually, we don't have any sort of greater intention beyond that. That's why there's a famous story in Words of My Perfect Teacher. You might remember that, where the Buddha had a cousin called Nanda, who was very attached to his life of sensuality, and at one point, then the Buddha introduced him to the higher realms, where there was even more sensuality. It was more interesting. And the cousin was very impressed. He said, "Oh, wow." He was, thanking his cousin for introducing him to this. Now, hey, how do I get here? He said. And the Buddha says, well, that's the kind of karmic result that comes from taking ordination. And then Nanda, he was like, okay, well, hey, if that's what it takes, I'm in. And then after that, he had taken ordination. Then the Buddha showed him one of the lower realms, a hell realm of some sort. And Nanda said, "What's this?" And he says, "Well, that's what happens once the sort of very minimal little merit that comes from taking the monastic ordination with purely from the intention of just benefiting oneself. When that little bit of good karma exhausts, then this is what comes after." And so at that point, Nanda, he kind of finally got a little bit serious. The thing is, if you're, the cousin of the Buddha, you're exposed to greatness. And he then finally sort of began to, you could say, click to and get with the program a little bit. So of course, the Buddha would only have done this only because Nanda had that potential. So that's just to say here then, Kangyur Rinpoche then says, but as the story of Nanda shows, it is when the determination to leave samsara really takes birth within the mind that the mere vow is transformed into the authentic commitment of pratimoksha. Nevertheless, even though the intention becomes more vast and there is a change of attitude, the original commitment to avoid negativities is not cancelled. So that's where there has to be a genuine, you could say a genuine renunciation. Thus it is that as one receives the three successive types of pratimoksha precept, the lower aspects of the pratimoksha are not at all superseded. On the contrary, the commitment to reject negative behavior is fortified and developed. So that's where a bodhisattva who then graduate, a practitioner of the pratimoksha who becomes a bodhisattva, they, of course, they're even to a greater extent, they are achieving what the pratimoksha intends. So that's where, as such, to the bodhisattva vow, then all the sort of the purposes of individual liberation, such as rejecting the causes of suffering, is automatically taken care of. So he says, this is shown by the Vinaya teaching that if at some later stage the higher precepts are given back, the person in question reverts to the lower ordination, for example, that of Shramanera taken before. So that's where if you then go back on your vow, then at least you have that. However, when the highest ordination is taken, the lower two do not remain as separate sets of vows. So that's where if someone then takes a higher level of ordination as a monastic, of course, the other ones are still in place. The purpose is still in place, but there's not like they have to then also look after those as separate vows. If this were the case, i.e., if it were possible for two sets of vows to remain as distinct entities, it would follow that a man who has the vow of Upasaka, who later takes full ordination, is simultaneously monk and layman, since the Upasaka ordination belongs to the lay state. So this is just like you can't be two places at once, just like, the 10-year-old is not there together with the 15-year-old, even though the 15-year-old obviously grew out of the 10-year-old, and so on. The same applies if, in addition to the pratimoksha vow, one goes on to take the vow of bodhicitta that aims at the welfare. The same applies if, in addition to the pratimoksha vow, one goes on to take the vow of bodhicitta that aims at the welfare of others. While the specifically pratimoksha aspect is associated with the bodhisattva commitment, the determination to free only oneself from samsara is transmuted. So that's where pratimoksha, meaning individual liberation, is essentially just about oneself. That's why we also in the Mahayana refer to this as the Hinayana. But of course, the objective of the Hinayana is to put an end to suffering. And when someone takes the bodhisattva vow, they are also putting an end to suffering. They're also putting an end to committed to put an end to suffering for others. But you could say the purpose of one's own liberation is taken care of through that. So it says here, the vow of pratimoksha becomes indistinguishable from the attitude of bodhicitta endowed with the twofold aim. Twofold aim is then the aims of benefiting oneself and benefiting others as well. Whereas the pratimoksha, that's just a onefold, a singular aim, namely one's own liberation. So it says here, when copper ore is smelted, the extracted copper is not substantially different from the original material. Yet, if the quality of its preceding state persisted in the copper, the end result would have to be both ore and extracted copper at the same time, which is impossible. Likewise, when the determination to free oneself from samsara is improved through taking the bodhicitta vow, the resulting attitude of mind is not substantially different from the previous one. Yet, if it did not lose its earlier inferior quality, the resulting mindset would be both selfish and unselfish at the same time. And this is impossible. So that is where the initial, what we could call selfish objective of individual liberation, one might then take a vow that goes further than that. The initial quality of that inspiration, of course, is still there to extract oneself from suffering, but it also then is now imbued with something that is selfless. And so that's why one doesn't at that time still be a selfish person and a selfless person. So it kind of goes without saying, but it's important to make these points. Okay. Actually, does anyone have any questions at this stage? Let's just see if there's some questions here. Is one of the goals of taking vows, any level of them, also to make us understand that at one point that the whole concept of vow and keeping or breaking them is just a concept? It's just a concept. It's just a concept almost absurd as such. Well, yes, there's always the notion of the vows being, you could say, vehicles. So that's where you could say at the ultimate level, then the vehicle is left behind. We travel, we cross the ocean, we leave the boat behind. We achieve, you say, realization. And of course, at that point, there's no notion of having any commitment of any kind. This will actually be further clarified in the following. Yeah. Example wisdom as referred to in the text, would that be the first glimpse of the nature of mind, pointing out the nature of mind by the guru? Yes. Now, the thing is, usually in tantric context, the example wisdom has to do with the practice of the third empowerment. So it has a little bit sort of a particular flavor in terms of the vocabulary. But in principle, it is something that gives us an idea where the pointing out to the nature of mind by the teacher could very well, should actually be, if possible, it's intended to be a place where there's absolutely clarity. So that's where the example wisdom is sort of points in that direction, but the actual wisdom itself is something that is you could say, fully experienced with complete certainty. Yeah. Okay, we can go a little further then. So in exactly the same way, when in addition to the bodhisattva vow, one receives the vow of the mantrayana, the altruistic attitude is itself raised to a higher power. This happens thanks to a confidence that arises through just a slight understanding of the state of purity and equality, to say nothing of when the ultimate wisdom of empowerment actually occurs, which is said to happen during the bestowal or practice of the four empowerments that are the basis of the generation and perfection stages. The altruistic attitude is thus enhanced and transmuted into the mantrayana vow, so that although the mantrayana attitude is not substantially distinct from the bodhisattva attitude, the difference now is that no discrimination is made, even on the relative level between samsara and nirvana, accepting the one and rejecting the other. And that's where the level of mantrayana goes far beyond the scope of the general bodhisattva vow. But at the same time also, it really builds on the bodhisattva vow. When beginners like ourselves reflect about the way in which we hold the three vows simultaneously, all we can say is that when and as pure perception, the essence of the mantrayana, and the view that results from hearing and reflecting on the teachings increase and strengthen, we undergo a transformation of attitude, although this is not the same as the birth of the wisdom that comes through the power of meditation. So that's, of course, where when there is someone who's on the path, it doesn't mean that they have full realization. But nevertheless, there is increasingly a shift in attitude. Then it says, when through meditation, the example wisdom or extraordinary wisdom is realized, this implies that the ordinary mind has been transmuted into primordial wisdom, and the mastery of the expanse, of ultimate reality has been gained. So this is what we talked a little bit before in Veronica's questions, when actually we, at that point, then there's complete mastery. So he says, the direct realization of ultimate reality gives control of all sense objects and afflictions, so that whatever yogis or yoginis do, they cannot be defiled by downfalls in the ordinary sense of the word. And although it may seem to an outside observer that such practitioners are acting in accordance with the precepts, from their side, there is no clinging to the precepts of the lower vows as external independent entities, and they are thus beyond any intentional acceptance and rejection. So that's why you could have a very great tantrika who's simply just remaining in a state free of concepts, naturally is, you could say, free of the flaws of aggression and desire. that who naturally has compassion, and yet they are in no way actually, you could say, this just is a natural outflow of their realization. Let's see what the so it says, in other words, the practitioner is beyond observance of the vows and also beyond violation of them. So that's like we were saying. Here, the three vows undergo a complete transformation. It goes without saying that they are not separate entities. At that stage, the yogis and yoginis are bhikkhus and bhikkhunis in the truest, most spontaneous sense. It is said in the Guhyagarbha Tantra, the discipline arising from the Vinaya and the inconceivable array of all the vows are all contained, are pure without exception in supreme and unsurpassable Samaya. And Saraha, who was later the ordaining abbot of Nagarjuna himself, said, "Till yesterday I was still a Brahmin. Till yesterday I was not a monk. But taking to myself an arrow maker's daughter, I am indeed a monk henceforth, a supreme monk and glorious Heruka." So that's where this is sort of a famous quote really about then Saraha in taking the arrow daughter as his consort. Then there was sort of the criticism that he wasn't a monk anymore. And he says, yes, in fact, now I'm more a monk than I had ever been before. So in this way, at that level of then realization, then naturally all the intention of the various vows are naturally in place. So I hope that makes sense. I think let's leave it at that here. Can you please go over the four empowerments? Sure. So in general, when we approach the Vajrayana, we practice the tantric preliminaries. And these actually culminate in the Guru Yoga, where hopefully on the basis of our devotion, then, and of course the kindness of the teacher, then something takes place in which there's a realization, an insight into the teacher's wisdom. And that's where the teacher's wisdom is no longer seen as just abiding in the teacher, but as something in which where we meet with the teacher within our own mind. So in the Guru Yoga, which means literally union with the teacher, we discover, you could say, the inner teacher. We discover the inner Buddha. And that is then where the teacher gives us empowerment, the first empowerment, where the teacher says, you have from the very origin, you have been a Buddha. Now please maintain that understanding. And on the basis of that insight, then I empower you and I give you then these four empowerments that are ways to then integrate this insight into this wisdom nature. That is you could say, the understanding the quality of the Buddha as abiding within. And that's where then on the practice of the first empowerment, the vase empowerment, we begin to cut through the ordinary understanding of ourself as a karmically constructed individual with our own particular, karmic body, the karmic perception we have of the world. And we begin to see how actually intrinsically our being is pure. And that's where the practice of sadhana introduces the purity of ourselves and the world. Then the second empowerment goes even deeper. At a more subtle level, it begins to dismantle our dualistic conception and dissolve this through a more subtle practice of understanding this purity within our own being. And similarly, also the third empowerment. The second empowerment has a lot to do with the practice of what we call nadi and prana. It has lots to do with working with our own body. The third empowerment has more to do with the essence, and that's where we talked about libido and also engaging with another person. So that's the third empowerment. And it's then through the third empowerment that there is the experience of what we call the example wisdom that then leads to the fourth empowerment, which is then the introduction to the actual nature of our being in its unconfused, most naked, unconfused, you could say, the ground of our being. And that's then the practice of Dzogchen, or the Great Perfection, or Mahamudra. So in this way, the first empowerment really is the practice of sadhana and the practice of discovering the purity of ourself in the phenomenal world. And then the second and third empowerments are more to do with yoga practice that introduces this in a more subtle way. And then finally, then the fourth empowerment introduces us to the very place in which all fundamental delusion is completely liberated. So that's the practice of the Great Perfection. So that's briefly on the four empowerments. Okay. All right, we'll conclude at this point. Let's just see here. Just a sec. Okay. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together.